I mentioned I'm reading Karl Popper again, and he's talking about Plato and philosopher kings and what freedom is and what security is, the state, all that kind of stuff. It's so interesting. And when he's talking about totalitarianism way back then, and Karl Popper's critiquing it, it's amazing because it's so completely up to date, even though he started writing that book, or the first edition was in the late 30s, I think, and then World War II came about, and then there were a couple other iterations of that book into the 50s, I think. Anyway, it's so alive, maybe the language is a little bit different than what we're accustomed to today, but it's awesome. I recommend everybody read that, because if you're concerned about populism and government and so on and so forth, yeah, it's great. So the difference between Plato and Socrates, that's a big part of it.
Avoiding the Civil War were, unfortunately, not those right. And he might have added further that, from the point of view of historical property, the question appears to be perhaps not quite irrelevant, but at any rate of secondary importance. Social life is violent, Marxism insists, and the class war claims its victims every day. What really matters is the result, socialism. To achieve this result is the essential characteristic of the social revolution. Now, if we could take it as established, or as intuitively certain...
When I think about the open society and its enemies, I don't know where to start. It's such a rich book, and it comments on really important things. And it has a very broad scope, but it's still narrowed in on totalitarianism, fascism, understanding the big man's role in society, historicism. And he's critiquing Plato, Aristotle, Hegel, Marx. These are pillars of the philosophical community. And he does it from a very unique perspective and in such an interesting context that even today it's profoundly relevant to what's going on in the world in terms of populism, in terms of understanding where we come from, where we're going, and so on. Like I was saying before, I hear Sam Harris talking to really brilliant writers from the Atlantic with Pulitzer Prizes and who have authored multiple books on policy, on history, on huge earth-shattering events and so on. And basically they're just careerists, apologists for the status quo, for the system in which we find ourselves now. This is the way they make their money. So you have a little bit of a criticism of the Democrat or the Republican or the way that this foreign leader did things and that foreign leader did things, and economics and so on and so forth. But basically you're discussing them within the current context of the way things are now. So there's no real room to critique the system or the world systemically or structurally. It just doesn't exist. Their jobs depend on doing a good job apologizing for the way things are, basically. And when you read someone like Karl Popper, he's really exercising this wonderfully scientific, critical thinking where he's trying to examine what's really going on and how it impacts the world at the moment. And because it's so vital and so rich with meaning and with understanding of how things are, how things work, it it never loses its relevance or its profound quality, you know. It's an exciting book that you have to own, you know, a paperback or a hardcover, and even on the Kindle, and even audiobook, and see what it can teach you. I can put in my essay or in the description of this video short treatments of Plato, Aristotle, Hegel, Marx that kind of give you an overview of their basic inclinations, thought, beliefs, whatever. But it's going to be very shallow. The only way to really understand Marx is to read Marx, to study Marxist criticism, to read books about Marx, books that criticize him, or books that seek to emulate his thought or realize it in some way. And the same thing if you're comparing Hegel to Kant or to other philosophers, you know. Hume is more my speed. Hegel is hard for me to understand. But if you can understand how they stack up against each other by reading multiple books about them, you can start to understand what their philosophy is. And Karl Popper's critique of Hegel is brilliant. The way it seeks to portray Hegel as somebody who's kind of an absolutist in this, and historicist, in the sense that, you know, we can find out what happened in history and how it eventually teleologically, you know, heads towards a certain place where it finds its essence and purity, and then, you know, the right people, like the philosopher kings of Plato, will come to power and run everything in perpetuity like a machine, you know, as opposed to. And it's interesting also to note that when he's criticizing Plato, you know, Plato is the one who put down in words, who wrote down what Socrates was thinking and saying in those dialogues, the symposium and so on. Without Plato writing it down, we wouldn't know Socrates. And even though for some people it's debatable whether Socrates existed, just like whether Jesus existed, most people recognize that someone like Socrates existed, and Plato probably was fairly deferential to his teacher. Well, Plato went on and taught Aristotle, and Aristotle Alexander the Great, and so on and so forth. So, and it you know, you go from way back when and you kind of evolve into the future, and eventually you find the pure essence of whatever it is. So this was part of the mythology of Nazi Germany, you know, that somehow this Teutonic knight came out of Prussia, and Popper mentions that Prussia was Slavic. Well, it was for a period of time when the Slavs were overrunning the Baltic tribes of that region. It's interesting, you know, if you're reading, you say, okay, for example, there's a quote in there where he attributes to Kant, I think, or maybe somebody Kant was talking about, but this proverb that says, God protect me from my friends, I can protect myself from my enemies. And you can look it up and say, well, who said that? Was it Voltaire? Was it Kant? Was it somebody else? Is it a proverb? Was it in the Bible? Was it in the I Ching? Was it in the Tao Te Ching? You know, did Miyamoto Musashi say something like that? You know, a lot of times these kinds of observations are kind of commonsensical and universal. When we're trying to understand the big picture, when we're trying to understand how things integrate, how they all come together, and form this mysterious universe and how interdependent everything is, it doesn't mean that we don't have to figure out how to run things, operate things, on this terrestrial kind of, pedestrian level, right? Another thing Popper is concerned with is just being humble in the face of incremental scientific progress, right? So nobody knows everything. You can use all the emphatic speech and word salad you can dream up to try to act like you know the answers or you've come up with the formula and so on. But we don't. It's always going to be mysterious. And trying to understand how things integrate and work together is part of the process of gradually understanding the mystery of the universe and of human life and culture and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, I could go on and on and on about this book forever. It has a great introduction by Václav Havel, which really encapsulates a lot of the spirit of the book, which I recommend you read at least if you can get a hold of that. But this is why I'm always enthusiastic about telling people to read, primary sources of things. Don't just read what Jordan Peterson seems to say in some bizarre way about something or another, mythology or dragons or lobsters or Jung or whatever. Figure out what he read and see if he read it right, because sometimes he didn't. And it's the same thing with other intellectuals. But an intellectual should have this generosity of spirit and humility where they can admit and really cherish the fact that they don't know it all. They don't have the answers. And therefore, when you're trying to think in a perfection of ideals kind of sense or a utopian sense, you're not being utopian. You don't think you're going to arrive at that place by understanding history or anything else. You just understand that you feel like human beings have the capacity to make things better bit by bit. Now, alongside that, I was mentioning the Sam Harris podcast. Well, Sam Harris made a point that, we're not going to educate everyone in America on civics in the next 2 years before the boogeyman, some form of Trumpist boogeyman, comes back and runs for election. So what are we going to do in the meantime? Well, yeah, we're never going to get everyone educated in civics unless we try, unless we think that it's important to do so, and then it's going to take time and resources. But are we going to spend time and resources educating people, or are we going to spend our time and resources playing the game, keeping our seat at the table, being careerist apologists for the system, making sure that military-industrial complex corporations get their contracts and their budgets so they can build all kinds of wonderful equipment that we can use to destroy each other? What are we going to value? What are we going to invest in? And who decides? And that's in the book as well. Who rules? Who decides who rules? Is it the crazy democratic mob of ignoramuses who don't know shit about civics? They're going to decide who to vote for? Or is it the inner circle, the true citizens who have certain qualifications and understanding capabilities and so on? Or is it the big boss, is it Tony Soprano or the Godfather or the dictator or, the father of the nation? What is nationality? What is nationalism? When did nation states start? How long have they been around in the current form that we seem to understand them now? All these things are there. You can ask these questions, and by doing so and exploring these lines of inquiry and philosophic inquiry and so on, you can start to make sense of it yourself and think about it in your own way, in your own terms. And maybe lots and lots of people that can do that, that can think for themselves, can eventually constitute some form of open society where democratic values can really be put to bear on important issues and important projects of our time, right? If we go to game B and we say, there has to be gatekeepers, who are going to be the gatekeepers, who's going to watch the watchers? If we have to keep a Sivian population down to 150 or 1,000 or whatever the number is because we think that's what the science says or that's what history tells us or whatever. How do we decide that? How do we scale that? How do we have this plurality of different solutions for things, this kind of libertarianism, and still have effectively run communities that are sustainable, where the price discovery of natural capital and human capital and all these different things is baked into the way things are run, the structure of things, and so on, right? It's really hard to say, but reading these kinds of books helps. And that's why I'm always begging people to just take some time. It'll excite you, it'll inspire you, And other than that, we're just being buffeted about like kelp in the tide. We're stuck in this one place, we're kind of being pushed one way or another by our emotions and our brain chemistry and propaganda and stories and marketing and advertising, that kind of thing. We really have no clue what the fuck's going on. And I can't call myself a sovereign man if that's my state of being, or a man with agency or free will, or a person who's going to make good, calculated decisions that affect my life and other people's lives in a positive way, and so on and so on. So that's really what I'm on about when I'm talking about that stuff. There's so much to talk about. It's such a deep discussion. There's so many angles to it and avenues that branch off from it that you can't just sit in front of a camera and just extemporaneously blah blah about it and do it justice. So read that book, okay? The Open Society and Its Enemies by Karl Popper. And look into the people that Karl Popper is talking about and critiquing. Understand different points of view of Plato, Aristotle, Marx and Hegel, or Hegel and Marx, And then see how it applies to modern populism, to the Trump phenomenon, to the Jordan Peterson phenomenon, to our intellectual influencers of the day, and how important they are, right? Our entertainers, our shock jocks, our commentators, our authors, our artists. And you'll be able to think about it in your own terms. The only way you can do that is to educate yourself. Get your education and continue to educate yourself, or to seek educational opportunities from others, from institutions, from MOOCs, from videos, and so on. If we don't all get busy doing that, we're screwed. Because it is true. How are we going to do all this in one generation, 2 generations? It's been generations of people, and we keep going around and around and around in circles, right? What are we achieving other than having really nice cameras to sit in front of when you're out in the park, making a YouTube video, streaming, live streaming, all the entertainments and the excitement, the Super Bowl halftime shows, everything we love. And sometimes I wonder, and I'd like to talk about it sometimes, future generation, who gives a damn, right? I want my truck. I want to be better than most men in my mind, I want to win the arguments. I want attention, validation. I got to have a huge house with 27 guest rooms even though I'll never have 27 people over at my house, you know, I gotta have status, I gotta have more money than you could possibly ever imagine. It's sick. It's a kind of pathology. It's a kind of grotesque exaggeration of what it means to be a pathological human being. I think we can sort out for ourselves what's healthy and what matters if we really, really, really think about it. And to do that, we have to audit our own thoughts and critique our own thoughts as well. Anyway, I gotta stop. I'll just keep going. So that's it. I'm trying to work that out. I'd like to do something more interesting in terms of visuals and whatnot. It takes a lot of planning to make a really good video with B-roll and with downloading images and video segments that reinforce what you're talking about. But anyhow, I'd like to do more of that, but I'd also like to engage with people who want to actually produce something in collaboration, you know, as a team, as a clique of people trying to accomplish something. I can dream. I'm not dead yet. Bulliam T. Out.
Achieve this result is the essential characteristic of the social revolution. Now, if we could take it as established, or as intuitively certain, that capitalism will be followed by socialism, then this explanation of the term social revolution might be quite satisfactory. But since